I once tried to make sourdough. I had the digital scale, the temperature-controlled proofing box, the feeding schedules charted on an Excel sheet. I was really trying to engineer a perfect loaf.
Uh-huh.
What I actually got was, well, basically a dense, sour brick. It was so frustrating. I was convinced I'd missed some variable.
Right. The control mindset.
Exactly. Then I remembered visiting this tiny, really ancient miso shop way out in rural Japan. The owner, this older gentleman, showed me his giant wooden barrels. Some were definitely older than he was.
Wow.
And I asked him, how do you control the temperature? How do you measure the bacteria? And he just smiled, pointed to the old wooden beams, the plaster walls of the building itself, and said, "We don't. We trust the building. We trust the air."
That's fascinating.
Yeah, he wasn't controlling anything. He was, collaborating. That complete surrender to the process, this deep trust in something totally invisible, felt so foreign to me. But the miso we tasted, it was incredible. It wasn't just food. It felt like tasting time itself.
That story is such a perfect way into our deep dive today. It really captures this profound cultural reliance on collaboration and trust in natural processes.
Okay.
So we're exploring two concepts in Japanese culture. They're distinct, but, deeply linked by this idea of surrender you mentioned.
Yeah.
Hakko, which is the incredibly refined art and science of fermentation.
Right, the miso maker's world.
Exactly. And then Wabi Sabi, the kind of overarching philosophy that really advocates for accepting natural flow, imperfection, and deep impermanence.
That's a huge scope, though. We're going from the microscopic world bacteria, molds, all the way up to a macro philosophy about, how we should approach life, anxiety, even our goals.
That's the journey we're on. Our mission today is really to understand the impact of this mindset. We'll look at how this trust shapes food, how it might contribute to Japan's remarkable longevity, how it provides a framework for personal resilience, dealing with trauma even. And finally, we'll touch on how a key term related to all this has gotten tangled up in some complex, ambiguous historical interpretations.
Okay.
It's fundamentally a deep dive into letting go of that rigid control you talked about and maybe finding the power in things being, unfinished.
All right, let's start with that collaborative empire, the microbial world you mentioned in the miso shop, Hakko, fermentation. When we talk Japanese cuisine, it feels like we are talking about a food culture basically built by microbes.
Oh, absolutely. Without Hakko, you really don't have iconic Japanese cuisine. You lose sake, the delicate rice wine. You lose soy sauce, miso.
The essentials.
Totally. And you definitely lose the incredible variety of tsukemono pickles, those crisp, tangy vegetables that are just fundamental to almost any Japanese meal. Fermentation takes simple, sometimes pretty bland raw materials and transforms them into products bursting with umami, complexity, and, crucially, a much longer shelf life.
So, lay out the basics for us. Gastronomically speaking, what's actually happening chemically during fermentation?
Okay, so at its core, fermentation is a metabolic process. It's driven by specific microorganisms, could be bacteria, yeasts, or molds, and they work using anaerobic respiration.
Meaning no oxygen needed.
Exactly. They thrive without oxygen. These tiny organisms consume sugars and starches, and they convert them into this huge array of complex byproducts. And those byproducts are what we taste, and also what preserve the food.
And the variations in those byproducts, that's where all the different flavors come from, right?
Precisely. That's the magic. So take some common examples. If you have a specific bacterium metabolizing sugar, and it mostly produces acetic acid, you get vinegar, that sharp, sour taste.
Okay.
If the process yields lactic acid, which you see in tsukemono pickles, or think sourdough starters, yogurt, and other places, you get a tannier, sometimes kind of creamier result. But the real artistry, the Hakko genius, comes down to managing the environment.
Like the miso maker trusting his building.
Exactly like that. Tiny, deliberate shifts in temperature, the kind of vessel used like those old wooden barrels, harboring specific cultures, how long you ferment it, and the exact local microbes involved. All these things completely change the final product's flavor, aroma, texture, even its nutritional profile. This high variability, achieved through meticulous, often generational knowledge, is really the economic backbone and the cultural genius behind Hakko.
Okay, this brings us to, the star of the show, you could say. The engine powering so much of this complexity in Japanese food, Koji.
Absolutely. Koji mold.
Yeah.
Scientifically, it's Aspergillus or rhizae. It's indigenous to Japan, and it is the absolute core element fueling so much traditional Japanese fermentation. Okay. It's essential for miso, sake, mirin, soy sauce.
So many staples.
Its cultural importance is just immense. In 2006, this tiny microscopic thing was officially designated the the national fungus of Japan.
The national fungus, that says a lot.
It really does. It's a powerful statement about how useful microbes are seen to be and the deep respect for them.
We hear about Koji a lot now, even in Western cooking, but for those of us who aren't food scientists, how does it actually work? What's the main job of this national fungus?
Its main job is to act like a highly specialized chemical factory, really. Koji mold produces massive amounts of 3 key types of enzymes: amylase, protease, and lipase. These enzymes are the real workhorses.
Okay, let's break those down. Amylase, what does that one do?
Amylase is critical for breaking down starches, think the starches in rice, barley, or soybeans, into simpler fermentable sugars.
Ah, right.
So for SIG brewing, this is vital. The complex starches in the rice grain need to be broken down first, so the yeast can then step in and convert those sugars into alcohol.
Right.
Amylase kicks off that whole process.
Got it. And protease, sounds like protein.
It does deal with protein. Protease breaks down complex proteins into their building blocks, peptides and amino acids. And this is the crucial step for creating umami.
That savory fifth taste.
Exactly. Glutamate, which is the main driver of that umami sensation, that deep, satisfying, savory quality, is an amino acid. Protease releases it by acting on proteins, especially in soybeans when making miso and soy sauce. This explains why a long-fermented miso is so much richer and more savory than just plain soybeans. Protease really dictates that final depth of flavor.
Makes sense. And the last one, lipase.
Lipase breaks down fats, or lipids. Now, this might be less central to the flavor in something like pure sake, but in products like miso, breaking down fats can definitely affect the texture, the richness of the aroma, the overall mouthfeel. Essentially, what Koji is doing is pre-digestion.
Pre-digestion.
Yeah, it's making the nutrients in the raw ingredients much more accessible, both for the other microbes involved in the fermentation, like yeasts, and eventually for our own bodies when we eat the final product.
That idea of pre-digestion, making nutrients more available, that seems to connect directly to a broader philosophy about the human body itself in Japan.
It connects immediately and profoundly. Traditional Japanese food culture doesn't just see the body as, a machine or a container. It often views it as a planet, a whole ecosystem hosting literally tens of trillions of diverse bacteria.
Wow, a planet inside us.
It's an ancient idea, this understanding, predating modern microbiome science by centuries. And it leads to this deep, almost spiritual respect for microbial power. In this view, traditional food culture is fundamentally about feeding the body's internal bacterial population, nurturing a healthy, diverse, robust inner world.
It's really fascinating how that ancient wisdom seems to line up so well with what contemporary science is discovering now about the gut microbiome influencing everything from our immune system to mental health.
Exactly. And the observable data, the health outcomes, seem to reinforce the success of this traditional approach. When you look at global health statistics, Japan consistently has the longest average life expectancy among all the G7 nations.
That's a huge difference. What specific dietary links do the studies point to? Is it just the fermented foods?
Well, studies strongly suggest that the regular, centuries-long consumption of fermented foods plays a significant role. For instance, eating fermented soy products, especially nacho, which, is famous for its strong flavor and sticky texture.
Yes, very distinctive.
Very distinctive. Its consumption has been statistically linked to significantly lower rates of heart disease, a lower incidence of type 2 diabetes, and dramatically lower overall obesity rates compared to Western populations.
And what makes that so striking, as you alluded to, is that the traditional Japanese diet isn't typically low carb, right? It relies heavily on rice.
That's right. By many Western nutritional models, you might predict that level of carbohydrate intake could lead to higher rates of certain metabolic diseases.
Well, it doesn't seem to.
The hypothesis is that the high inclusion of fermented foods acts as a kind of counterbalance. These foods introduce potent prebiotics and probiotics, which improve gut diversity and function. This might potentially mitigate some of the metabolic risks associated with high intake of simple carbs. Plus, certain compounds found specifically in fermented products, like nattokinase and nacho, have actually been shown in studies to have blood-thinning properties. That's likely a key factor contributing to the reduced rates of cardiovascular disease.
Now, you mentioned earlier we need to be a bit cautious here, scientifically speaking. If the correlation looks so strong, where's the challenge in proving it definitively?
The challenge is proving causation in humans, beyond a shadow of a doubt. When we talk about longevity and diet, we're dealing with incredibly complex systems. not single variables.
Right.
We're looking at a population that also tends to eat more seafood, walks more, uses public transit more, often practices portion control principles like harahachibo.
Too many factors.
Exactly. To truly confirm, say, that natcha causes improved heart health, you need an enormous, multi-year, randomized, double-blind, controlled human experiment.
Which sounds practically impossible to run.
It really is. Just imagine trying to isolate thousands of people, control their entire diet, exercise, stress levels, environment for, say, 20 years, and then give half of them a placebo natchu without them knowing.
The logistics alone.
The logistical, financial, and ethical hurdles are just immense. So much of our understanding has to rely on strong correlational data from large observational studies combined with the, well, established wisdom of a culture that has demonstrably achieved exceptional health outcomes by collaborating with and trusting these microbial processes for generations.
That idea of collaboration and deep trust is actually the perfect bridge, isn't it? We're moving now from trusting the invisible work of microbes, Hakko, to this larger macro-philosophical acceptance of the flow of life itself, Wabi Sabi.
Exactly. Wabi Sabi is often kind of casually mentioned as just an aesthetic, a chipped bowl, maybe some rough linen fabric, minimalist decor.
Yeah, that's how I usually hear it.
But at its core, it's a much deeper, profound philosophical framework for how to exist. If Hakko is the practice of trusting natural processes in food, you could say Wabi Sabi is the framework for trusting natural processes in life.
So how do we define it as a worldview then, not just a design trend?
Well, it's fundamentally an existential philosophy, deeply rooted in Zen Buddhism. It's built on the really profound realization that perfection, it's an illusion. It only exists in the human imagination or maybe in the abstract world of mathematics.
Not in reality.
Not in the real living world. That world is inherently dynamic, it's incomplete, it's often asymmetric. Wabi Sabi is the act of recognizing, accepting, and actually celebrating the ephemeral nature of all things, the beauty found in the incomplete, the value of the imperfect, and the essential quality of impermanence.
I find that idea incredibly liberating, especially today in a world that constantly pushes us towards these rigid, Instagram perfect ideals. It feels like an antidote to a lot of modern anxiety.
It absolutely is a liberation from what some call the tyranny of the perfect. We can kind of distill this philosophy into three interconnected principles that guide a life lived with Wabi Sabi. The first one is, nothing is perfect.
That seems like maybe the hardest one for modern Western society, at least, to really accept.
It can be.
Yeah.
But accepting imperfection is seen as absolutely crucial for mental and spiritual health. It leads to genuine humility, which frees us from those unhealthy, often quite debilitating self-demanding expectations we put on ourselves and on others. The source material uses a strong metaphor. If we constantly chase non-existent perfection, we become rigid, almost fossilized. We lose the flexibility we need to adapt, to learn, to grow. Humility, which comes from accepting we're flawed, is actually the prerequisite for real resilience.
So rigidity is the enemy, really. It's the opposite of a Wabi Sabi approach, which makes sense if everything is constantly flowing. What's the second principle then?
The second is, nothing is finished. Everything, whether it's a work of art, a human being, the environment itself, everything is dynamic and continually developing. You are a process, not a final product.
I like that, a process, not a product.
Yeah. It aligns perfectly with nature's constant cycles of creation, decay, rebirth. Embracing Wabi Sabi here means adopting an attitude of continuous learning, recognizing that your education, your character development, your mastery of anything, it's an ongoing journey.
Never complete.
Never complete. The Buddha himself is quoted as saying something like, "I am always beginning." This principle encourages us to realize that, in a way, everything is still to be done, and therefore everything is still to be lived. There's always potential.
That completely shifts the goalpost, doesn't it? The value isn't in arriving at some fixed destination, but in the continuous effort, the journey itself. And the third principle seems to tie back directly to that fleeting nature of everything you mentioned earlier.
Yes, exactly. Nothing lasts forever. This is the core truth of impermanence. This concept is really the philosophical engine driving Zen Buddhism, and it's often embodied by the Japanese term muju.
Let's talk about that overlap a bit more. How does Zen structure these deep truths about impermanence and maybe the suffering that comes with resisting it?
Zen really embodies these ideas through what are sometimes called the three keys to life, which provide the philosophical scaffolding for Wabi Sabi. The first key, as we just said, is impermanence, or muju. The full phrase often used is shogi muju, which translates roughly to the universal truth that all things are forever changing, constantly in flux, existing in a state of becoming rather than static being.
It's pretty amazing to think about how globally consistent these kinds of profound realizations were in the ancient world, isn't it?
It truly is. It's why the philosopher Karl Jaspers talked about the axial age, roughly 800 to 200 BCE. During this period, across totally separate cultures, India, China, ancient Greece thinkers seemed to arrive at similar fundamental conclusions about existence independently.
Wow.
So while Buddhism was developing the concept of muju in the East, you had the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus in the West coining the phrase pantare, which means everything flows. Essentially, the exact same realization reached halfway across the world. Recognizing muju, this constant flow, encourages us to ground ourselves firmly in the here and now, to really maximize the value of the present moment, rather than being paralyzed by regrets about the past or consumed by anxiety about an unpredictable future.
Because if everything is flowing and we try to cling tightly to things we want to be fixed, like an old way of life or a specific expectation or even our youth, then we're inevitably going to experience friction, resistance, maybe even pain. That seems to lead naturally to the second key, suffering.
Precisely. The second key is suffering, or dukkha. Now, in common Western usage, suffering often implies intense physical pain or severe trauma. But dukkha's original meaning in this context is actually far subtler and more pervasive. It translates perhaps better as constant dissatisfaction.
Dissatisfaction. With what specifically?
Dissatisfaction that arises from the fundamental gap between our current reality, the way things actually are, and our desires, the way we wish things were, what we hope to achieve, what we yearn to possess or control. The source material offers a really powerful, almost mathematical distillation of this. It suggests the happiness equation can be thought of as happiness, reality, desires.
Simple but profound.
Right. The larger the gap between what you have, your reality, and what you want, your desires, the greater the dukkha, the greater the dissatisfaction. So philosophically, if one could manage to reduce desires down towards zero, your happiness would become less dependent on external circumstances and free from that constant friction.
That provides such a stark contrast to a lot of modern consumer psychology, which often tells us happiness is achieved by increasing reality, acquiring more things, more status to try and meet these ever-increasing desires. Wabi Sabi and Zen seem to say, no, work on the desire side of the equation.
Exactly. It advocates for a radical acceptance of the current reality, however imperfect it may seem. And that focus leads directly into the third key, which is perhaps the most abstract: emptiness, or shunyata in Japanese ku.
Right, this term shunyata, or emptiness, it often gets misunderstood in the West, maybe as nihilism or suggesting that nothing matters or just literal nothingness.
It's really far from that.
Yeah.
In this context, shunyata is understood in two ways. First, as a fundamental component of reality itself. Reality is empty in the sense that no phenomenon, no object, no person possesses an intrinsic, unchanging, independent essence or existence. Everything's interdependent, interconnected, constantly changing.
So nothing exists in isolation.
Precisely.
Okay.
And second, shunyata is also a mental state we can cultivate. It's the practice of observing things, situations, people, thoughts, emotions, just as they are, without the filter of your ego, your desires, your judgments, your prejudices, or your past conditioning coloring your perception.
So it's like seeing the world without the constant overlay of me and my wishes and my fears, which sounds like the direct antidote to dukkha, to that dissatisfaction.
It is. The source material gives a beautiful analogy. Think about enjoying the twilight by the ocean shore. You're feeling connected to nature. You're not trying to add anything or take anything away. You're simply forming part of the flow, observing. In that moment, you're experiencing a kind of pure reality, free from the ego's demands. To cultivate this mental state, the philosophy sometimes encourages creating literal empty space in your life too. This could mean intentionally blocking out days in your calendar with no firm plans, just allowing space. Or maybe creating a physical space in your home, a shunyata room. Perhaps completely empty except for maybe a cushion, with a strict rule.
Yeah.
No electronic devices allowed inside.
Like a physical reminder.
Exactly, a physical reminder that internal contentment doesn't actually require constant external input or accumulation.
The philosophical framework is clearly powerful, but as we talked about earlier, the real value of any philosophy is how it applies in the real world, right? How does this acceptance of imperfection translate into actual resilience, especially when we face failure or loss or even trauma?
It translates directly into what we might call creative resilience. That's the process of not just bouncing back from flaws or setbacks, but actively finding the inherent value in those flaws, in the broken places. We can start with that simple yet really profound folk story of the farmer and the cracked bucket.
Oh, I love that story. It completely flips the script on what useful means. The perfect bucket was proud, right?
Yeah.
Focused only on delivering a full measure of water, but the cracked bucket felt ashamed.
Deeply ashamed. And that shame came from a purely utilitarian perfectionist view of itself. It felt useless because it only brought back half the water each trip. But the farmer steps in. He points out that he had specifically planted flower seeds only along the cracked bucket side of the path, knowing it would leak. That flaw was actually the essential feature, the very means by which the farmer had cultivated rows of beautiful flowers that he harvested daily to decorate his house. The flaw, unknowingly, was responsible for creating beauty.
The insight there feels crucial, whether you're thinking about company culture or even personal trauma recovery. True function isn't just about rigidly meeting some standard. It's about the ability to unveil an inner harmony, even through imperfect means.
Absolutely. And when you apply that to human experience, the cracks, the wounds become, as the saying goes, where the light gets in. The poet Derek Walcott talked about this idea when discussing kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery.
Right, with the gold lacquer highlighting the breaks.
Exactly. Highlighting them instead of hiding them. Walcott said something like, break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than that love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. The idea is that the healing process itself, the reassembly, creates something new, perhaps wiser, certainly more unique. Wounds don't diminish us. Handled with care, they can make us profound.
We see that principle applied so beautifully in the world of high art, too. I'm thinking of the story about the violinist Itzhak Perlman.
Perlman is such a profound example of this creative resilience in action. First off, because of the after effects of polio, he always plays the violin seated, which itself is a huge adaptation to physical limitation.
Right.
But during one very famous concert at Lincoln Center, just as he was beginning a complex piece, one of his 4 violin strings suddenly snapped. Loudly.
Oh, wow. Nightmare scenario for a musician.
Total nightmare. The audience froze. Everyone expected an immediate stop, a long, awkward pause while he got a new string, maybe even the end of the concert. But Perlman did something absolutely extraordinary. He closed his eyes for a moment, then immediately adapted. He mentally retuned the entire melody and played the whole incredibly demanding piece with extraordinary beauty and passion, using only the 3 remaining strings.
That must have been absolutely breathtaking to witness.
Reports say it was. It demonstrated so powerfully that artistic expression doesn't demand pristine, sterile perfection. It actually includes and can even be elevated by human mishaps, by adaptive resilience, by a deep trust in one's ability to flow with the unexpected. The imperfection of that moment arguably made the performance even more profound, more memorable.
And taking that concept to an even more tragic, almost national scale, the story of the tsunami piano involving the composer Ryuichi Sakamoto carries tremendous weight here.
It really does. It provides perhaps one of the most powerful modern testaments to finding meaning in imperfection in the spirit of Wabi Sabi. After the devastating 2011 Fukushima earthquake and tsunami, Sakamoto learned about a grand piano that had been completely submerged in the seawater in a school gymnasium. It was horribly warped.
Completely ruined, you'd think.
Most people would view it that way, yes. An object to be discarded. The wood was twisted, the internal mechanisms corroded. It could never be perfectly tuned again. The pitch was forever distorted, changed by the trauma it endured.
But Sakamoto
had it restored, not to its original state, but stabilized in its damaged state. He accepted its new, imperfect sound as a sound of survival, a raw, honest echo of the catastrophe. Later, when Sakamoto himself was diagnosed with cancer, he would often play this very instrument. He described the sounds it produced as like the wails of some undersea creature.
Wow.
He was embracing the painful, warped reality of the instrument, finding not just acceptance, but profound beauty and hope in something fundamentally broken and damaged. The piano's inability to achieve its former perfection became its strength. It transformed into a unique, powerful voice of resilience, survival, and the memory of nature's force.
So we move from personal trauma and art to thinking about how to strategically apply this philosophy of flow. If we can apply wabi-sabi thinking to a broken piano, surely we can apply it to a challenging life situation or maybe even a business pivot that didn't go as planned.
Absolutely. The application is all about cultivating flexibility and trusting the process rather than being rigidly attached to a specific outcome. We can look at Bruce Lee's famous philosophy here: be like water.
Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water.
Exactly. Water can flow gently, or it can crash with immense force. Being formless, in Lee's view, meant rejecting rigid prejudices, being transparent in your intentions, following your intuition. In any dynamic environment, whether it's martial arts, running a business, diplomacy, navigating a relationship, trusting the process over a fixed, predetermined objective gives you the ability to adapt instantly to changing circumstances.
Water adapts to the container it's in.
Precisely. We must adapt to the reality presented to us. And like water, you choose whether you need to flow around an obstacle or sometimes gather strength and crash through it. That choice comes from being present and adaptable, not from rigid planning alone.
That strategic flexibility feels like the polar opposite of the modern drive for constant accumulation, control, and more, which I guess brings us to the application of wabi-sabi principles and minimalist living.
This is where we can talk about minimalism, often framed in Japan by the concept of danshari. It's important to see this not just as a trendy way to declutter your house, but as an intentional philosophical practice. Danshari is actually a compound word. Dan means rejecting things you don't need before they even enter your life. Sha means throwing away the unnecessary things you already possess but don't use or value. And Ri means separating yourself from the underlying compulsion to acquire more non-essential possessions and distractions.
So it moves beyond just organizing your closet. It's targeting the fundamental psychological urge to acquire more stuff.
Exactly. It's really the antithesis of the dominant consumerist belief that happiness is primarily achieved by having more and newer stuff. The source material really points out that beyond a certain point, possessions often become a weight on the soul rather than a source of genuine happiness or freedom.
How so?
Well, think about it psychologically and practically. We invest huge amounts of our time, energy, and mental space into managing, cleaning, organizing, ensuring, upgrading, and worrying about our possessions. That constant investment of energy is a form of dukkha. It creates friction and dissatisfaction. The physical clutter we accumulate often mirrors the mental clutter we carry inside.
So the goal of danshari isn't just tidiness, it's about reducing that friction in life.
Yes, precisely. The ultimate goal is to consciously create empty space. Mental space, physical space in our homes, temporal space in our schedules. The idea is that this empty space allows what is truly essential, beautiful, and valuable in life to emerge and be appreciated, instead of being constantly drowned out by noise, stress, and the burden of too much stuff.
It reminds me of that quote
from Lao Tzu. Be content with what you have. Rejoice in the way things are. When you realize there is nothing lacking, the whole world belongs to you. Danshari is like the practical application of realizing there is truly nothing lacking.
And just circling back quickly to that first principle, the problem with seeking perfection. We often assume that the happiest people, those who rate themselves highest, are maybe the most functional or successful. But some data suggests the opposite might be true in certain contexts.
That's a really counterintuitive finding when you apply some of these wabi-sabi concepts to modern psychology and performance. Some studies looking at continuous improvement and resilience have found that people who consistently rate their happiness excessively high, say a 9 or a perfect 10 out of 10, can sometimes lack the necessary self-criticism or motivation needed for ongoing growth and improvement.
Because if everything feels absolutely perfect already, why would you bother trying to change or improve anything?
Exactly. They risk becoming complacent, maybe even rigid. Whereas individuals who rate their happiness slightly lower, perhaps a solid 8 out of 10, often demonstrate higher levels of goal orientation, proactive engagement with challenges, and a greater willingness to adapt, learn, and improve. It suggests that a certain degree of dissatisfaction, a healthy recognition of incompleteness and imperfection in oneself or one's situation, isn't necessarily a failure. It might actually be a necessary condition for wisdom, for growth, and for long-term resilience. The imperfection, that little bit of crack, is what invites the effort to learn and adapt. We talked about that core principle that nothing lasts forever, the cornerstone of Muju. That concept of profound impermanence shifts our focus, almost inevitably, to how a culture processes and confronts the ultimate impermanent, death. And this confrontation is absolutely central to the ancient geography and history of the Rokuhara area in Kyoto.
Tell us about the significance of this specific location, Rokuhara, especially in relation to how the ancient capital Hyankyu was originally planned.
Okay, so Hyankyu, the ancient capital we now know as Kyoto, was meticulously planned back in the 8th century. It was laid out as a near-perfect square grid, situated primarily on the western side of the Kummel River. This layout symbolized order, purity, imperial power, civilization.
Very controlled, very structured.
Very. But the eastern side of the river, the Rokuhara area, was fundamentally different. From early on, it was considered conceptually impure, maybe even polluting, because it served as the massive entrance to the Toribino graveyard. This wasn't just any cemetery. It was the primary place of disposal for everyone, from imperial family members down to the poorest commoners. It embodied the messy, chaotic reality of human mortality.
So the city was almost geographically and philosophically split. Order and life on the west side, chaos and death on the east.
That's a good way to put it. Rokuhara was thus inextricably linked to the inevitability of death, decay, the end of things. And it's within this liminal, often kind of grim area that a truly remarkable institution emerged. Rokuhara Mitsuji Temple. It was founded as a radically inclusive religious service facility.
Founded by whom?
By the legendary itinerant monk Kuya back in the 10th century. His mission seemed to be to embrace the entire populace, regardless of rank, in preparation for the afterlife, for navigating that great impermanence.
How radical was this inclusion, really, considering how rigidly hierarchical Heian period society was?
It was profoundly radical for its time. Kuya organized these massive Buddhist ceremonies, like the Daihanyagju ceremony held in 953. The written prayers, the Ganmon, composed for this event, were revolutionary because they explicitly stated the intention to include the entire populace. They prayed for the equal salvation of various lords, all the officials, priests, laymen, and people of all ranks.
Wow. Including even the very lowest classes, the outcasts?
Yes, explicitly. The ceremony became famous because it was attended by beggars the Henin, who were considered the lowest, most marginalized class in Japanese society back then. They actually gathered at the temple for the midday meal offered during the ritual. This level of spiritual democratization, offering salvation and even sustenance side by side in a major ritual setting, was remarkable. It defied the strict societal hierarchy in the face of universal death.
And did the temple serve others in that area?
Yes, it also specifically served the needs of the outcasts, the Hinin, who often lived near Rokuhara because their traditional occupations involved handling the dead, managing the Toribino graveyard. The temple allowed them the privilege of receiving alms during these important rituals, integrating them into the spiritual community.
And the temple upheld this all-embracing nature through its ongoing practices too, didn't it? Not just special events.
Absolutely. A great example is the continuous practice of the Mandu ceremony, the ceremony of 10,000 lamps. There's a traditional story associated with it, recalling how 10,000 lamps supposedly offered by a powerful king were all extinguished by a sudden gust of wind. But a single, humble lamp offered by a poor old woman kept burning brightly.
Ah, the moral being.
The moral was clear. The value of the offering rested not on the social rank or wealth of the donor, but on the sincerity of their devotion. So Rokuhara Mitsuji, following this principle, valued the lamps offered by commoners and even outcasts just as equally as those offered by nobles.
So Kikuya essentially established this incredible spiritual safety net, welcoming everyone, regardless of their status in this life, to prepare for the great impermanence, for death. That necessity for preparation then brings us to the detailed belief system about what happens after death, the system of posthumous justice.
That's right. That is the incredibly detailed belief system surrounding the 10 kings, or Jush. This is a powerful, highly structured system focused entirely on afterlife accountability. It lays out the deceased soul's journey through 10 successive courts, each administering judgment over a specific period following death.
It sounds almost like a spiritual bureaucracy or judiciary. Who are the key figures in this system, and what's the basic process?
Well, the most famous figure, the one many people might have heard of, is King Enma, who often presides over the central, most pivotal court. But there's a whole cohort of kings. The journey begins immediately after death. The soul faces different courts administered by various kings on specific days, the 7th day, the 14th, the 21st, the 28th, and so on up to the 3rd year.
Are there certain kings or moments that are considered particularly critical in determining the soul's fate?
Yes, there are 2 kings in the later stages who are often highlighted as especially crucial. There's King Bidud, whose name literally means equal or impartial, who administers the judgment that occurs on the 100th day after death. His role is explicitly to render judgment without any prejudice, based purely on the soul's deeds.
Okay.
And the whole process culminates with a final court, usually presided over by King Koji Tenrin, sometimes called the General of the Five Paths. He's the one who ultimately determines the deceased's final rebirth into one of the 6, or sometimes depicted as 5 paths of existence, which range from the lowest hell realms all the way up to the highest heavens, or even Buddhahood.
That sounds like an enormously complex and frankly intimidating process for the soul. What tools did these kings supposedly use to determine guilt and decide the final fate?
The courts are often depicted with really powerful iconography to show how judgment works. For example, a central element is frequently the karma mirror. This mirror is said to reflect, with perfect clarity, every single action, good and bad, performed by the person during their lifetime.
No hiding anything.
Yeah, exactly. Unlike human courts, where evidence can be manipulated, hidden, or argued away, the karma mirror provides impartial, irrefutable, visual evidence of the soul's complete moral ledger. The judgment by the kings is based directly on the weight of one's accumulated actions as revealed in this mirror.
The stakes are astronomically high then. Given this system, what could a living person or their family actually do to try and influence such an impartial, high-stakes judgment process? Could they intervene?
This is where the crucial role of rituals comes into play. These rituals were specifically designed to try and improve the soul's prospects in the afterlife courts. There are 2 main types of services. The first is post-mortem services, known as twizen. These are memorial services held by the surviving family members for the deceased. They often correspond to the feasts or ceremonies held on those key judgment days, the 7 feasts held in the 49 days immediately following death, for instance.
So the family is acting almost like the soul's defense attorney or advocate.
That's a great way to think about it. The family's offerings during twizen, which could include commissioning paintings or sculptures of Buddhist deities, burning incense, chanting sutras, all of this was believed to generate positive merit. And crucially, this merit could be spiritually transferred to the soul, currently undergoing judgment. The hope was this would ensure a more merciful judgment from the 10 kings, perhaps reducing the severity of the sentence in the afterlife. It was seen as an active participation by the living in the deceased's ongoing spiritual survival.
Okay, that makes sense for the family helping after death. But what about securing your own salvation while you were still alive? Could you anticipate this inevitable judgment and prepare in advance?
Absolutely. That was achieved through pre-mortem rituals, known as gyakushu. These were services held by living persons for themselves, or for a living person by others, performed specifically in advance of their death.
Proactive afterlife planning.
Exactly. And the belief was that gyakushu was actually even more effective than suizen. We have historical records, for example, of the incredibly powerful courtier Fujiwara no Mikanaga, who in 1023 meticulously commissioned sacred images and copies of sutras, preparing for 49 days of services to be held on his own behalf while still alive and healthy.
What was the logic behind that? Why was it considered more effective?
The logic was fairly straightforward. Offerings made while the person was still alive, still capable of generating merit through their own actions and sincere devotion, were considered more potent. They demonstrated foresight and piety. This proactive effort was believed to encourage more favorable, or at least merciful, judgments from the 10 kings when the person's time eventually came. This whole intricate system really shows a deep, proactive engagement with the concept of impermanence, trying to manage the profound uncertainty of the afterlife through devotion, ritual practice, and careful forward planning.
Okay, before we bring this deep dive to a close, there's a really vital cultural and linguistic distinction we need to make regarding terminology. When we've been discussing Hakko, the word for fermentation, we absolutely have to acknowledge a second, completely separate and historically very complex term that sounds identical.
Yes, that linguistic necessity is crucial to point out. The Japanese language, like many others, has numerous homophones, words that sound exactly the same but carry radically different meanings, usually distinguished by the written kanji characters and, of course, the context.
Right.
So throughout this discussion, we've been focused on the benign, collaborative concept of Hakko, meaning fermentation. Now, we need to briefly introduce the highly charged, politically significant term Hakkichu.
Okay. And the literal definition of Hakkichu is something like 8 crown cords, 1 roof, often translated more broadly as all the world under one roof.
That's right. Now, the original concept, which traces back to ancient Japanese mythological texts like the Nihon Shoki, allegedly represented a rather benign ideal, a kind of universal brotherhood, or bringing the world together harmoniously under the virtuous rule of the Japanese emperor. It was sometimes associated with the idea of the kingly way, a maxim emphasizing moral leadership. So the initial idea might have been one of peaceful, harmonious unification.
But as history shows, this idealistic phrase was later repurposed and, frankly, weaponized.
It was tragically distorted and politically exploited. The term Hakko didn't really enter common political circulation in Japan until 1940. It was Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe who popularized it in his administration's white paper on fundamental national policy.
And in that modern 1940s context,
In that context, it was explicitly utilized as a powerful imperialist slogan. It provided the ideological justification for Japanese expansionism and aggression throughout Asia during World War II. It was used to rationalize the creation of the so-called Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
so the idea of unifying the 8 corners of the world under one roof shifted dramatically from being potentially a virtuous, protective ideal to becoming a direct justification for military expansion and domination over other nations.
That is the complex and undeniably painful historical reality. While the term might have originated with a potentially benevolent idea of a universal family under Japanese guidance, in its 20th century application, it came to symbolize the forceful domination of Asia, particularly through military means, against any peoples who resisted Japanese rule. It's really important to include this distinction to demonstrate how cultural terminology can possess deeply layered, sometimes starkly conflicting meanings, and a thorough deep dive requires acknowledging and critically engaging with every level of that ambiguity, even when it's uncomfortable.
This has been a real journey of contrast today, hasn't it? From the invisible, teeming world of microbes and Hakko fermentation, all the way to the vast philosophical acceptance of life's inherent flow and imperfection in Wabi Sabi. The core takeaway, at least for me, really ties back to that opening anecdote about the miso maker. It's about the surrender of the illusion of control.
That really is the thread that binds these seemingly disparate concepts together, isn't it? In Hakko, you surrender the illusion of perfect, sterile control to the environment, to the microbes, and the result is often a superior, more complex, arguably healthier product.
Right.
And in Wabi Sabi, you surrender the illusion of control over life itself, over outcomes, over expectations, over the desire for permanence, and the result, ideally, is profound wisdom, humility, and deep resilience in the face of change.
The beauty of the unfinished seems to be the ultimate lesson that emerges, whether we're talking about a crack in a farmer's bucket, a snapped violin string, or maybe even a perceived flaw in our own character or life path.
Indeed. The acceptance of impermanence, muju, and incompleteness isn't meant to be a form of resignation or passive surrender at all. Instead, it's framed as a profound catalyst for continuous growth and learning. Because we accept that nothing is ever truly finished, and that we ourselves are always incomplete works in progress, life remains this exciting, continuous apprenticeship. That recognition of our inherent humility and incompleteness is what keeps us open to wisdom, open to change. You could argue that the moment we feel truly complete or perfect is often the moment we stop evolving, stop learning. And ultimately, this whole mindset, this acceptance, leads towards a celebration of the single fleeting moment. When we deeply understand that life is dynamic, flowing, and ultimately scarce, its very finite nature makes our time the most precious commodity we possess. There's that profound Japanese adage, ichigo ichi.
Yeah.
It translates roughly as one time, one meeting, or more poetically, none of what we are living in this exact moment will ever happen again in exactly the same way. That awareness allows us, hopefully, to stop clinging so tightly to desires and expectations for the future that we can't control, and instead to find the immense value, maybe even the value of eternity, within the singular, imperfect, unrepeatable moment we are experiencing right now.